January 11, 1944. The sky above Oschersleben, Germany, hung pale and brittle, the kind of winter morning where breath crystallized before it left the lungs. In the frozen fields below, farmers had learned to recognize the sound before they saw it, a distant, rhythmic drone that grew steadily louder, like the heartbeat of some mechanical god. They no longer ran to their cellars immediately. Instead, they paused, listening, calculating. American bombers came in daylight now, silver formations that caught the sun like schools of fish moving through an ocean of air. But something had changed in recent weeks. The men who worked the German anti-aircraft batteries had noticed it first. The bombers were different, not the aircraft themselves but their behavior. They flew tighter formations. They maintained course even when the flak bursts came close enough to rattle teeth. And most unsettling of all, they arrived at their targets with an escort that didn't turn back halfway across Germany. The Luftwaffe pilots who scrambled to meet them that morning carried with them 2 years of accumulated confidence. Since 1942, they had learned to time their attacks perfectly, waiting for the moment when the American heavy bombers, those flying fortresses and liberators, found themselves alone over the Reich, their escort fighters forced to turn back by empty fuel tanks. In those vulnerable minutes, the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs had carved through bomber formations like wolves through scattered sheep. The math had always favored the defenders. The Americans might have hundreds of bombers, but they bled aircraft at rates that couldn't be sustained. On October 14, 1943, just 3 months earlier, the 8th Air Force had lost 60 bombers in a single raid on Schweinfurt, 600 men who would never see another sunrise. The Germans called it Black Thursday, though not out of sympathy. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of what every Luftwaffe pilot believed, that daylight strategic bombing deep into Germany was impossible, that the Americans would eventually learn what the British had learned before them, that some battles could not be won by courage alone. But on this January morning, as the formations appeared over Oschersleben, the German pilots saw something that made their tactical certainty waver. Alongside the bombers, matching their pace and altitude, flew fighters they had encountered before, American P-47 Thunderbolts, blocky and powerful. But there were others now, sleeker aircraft with distinctive liquid-cooled engines and a predatory silhouette. The Mustang had arrived in European skies, and with it came a transformation so complete that within 6 months, the entire strategic calculus of the air war would be rewritten. The Focke-Wulf pilot who climbed into his cockpit that morning had been flying combat missions since 1941. He had shot down 17 Allied aircraft. He understood energy tactics, the importance of altitude, the way to calculate deflection when firing at a bomber from a beam attack. He had survived 3 years of aerial combat through a combination of skill, aggression, and the knowledge that over Germany, he fought with certain advantages. His airfields were close, his fuel was unlimited, his ammunition could be replenished between sorties. The Americans, by contrast, had been fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, their escorts forced to abandon them hundreds of miles before they reached their targets. This pilot, whose name appears in Luftwaffe records as Oberleutnant Heinrich Kraft, expected another day of calculated violence. What he encountered instead was the beginning of the end. The P-51 Mustang that intercepted him at 23,000 feet was flown by a captain from the 354th Fighter Group, one of the first units to receive the new fighters equipped with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The pilot had taken off from a base in England that morning knowing he had enough fuel to escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. This single fact, this mathematical reality of range and endurance, represented more than a tactical advantage. It represented the industrial and technological superiority of a nation that could design an airframe in California, made it with an engine from England, and produce it in quantities that would have seemed fantastic to anyone who remembered the Depression years just a decade earlier. The Mustang wasn't simply a good fighter aircraft. It was a symbol made of aluminum and gasoline, a demonstration that American abundance could be translated directly into military dominance. Kraft made his attack run with the confidence of experience, diving from altitude on a B-17 that had begun to lag behind its formation. It was a tactic that had worked hundreds of times before. But before he could close to firing range, the Mustang was on him, appearing with a speed that seemed impossible for an escort fighter at this altitude and distance from England. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. Kraft survived it, diving away and using every advantage of his aircraft's maneuverability to break contact. But he returned to his airfield with a damaged aircraft and something more troubling than bullet holes in his wings. He returned with doubt. The debriefing that followed was repeated in Luftwaffe bases across Germany that winter. Pilots who had dominated the skies for years found themselves reporting encounters with American fighters that shouldn't have been there, that couldn't have been there based on every previous experience with range and endurance. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The certainty that had sustained German fighter operations, the knowledge that if they could survive the initial encounters with escorts, they would have free rein over the bomber formations, had been shattered. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were being hunted by aircraft that seemed to have no intention of ever going home. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, though to the men experiencing it, the change felt sudden. The P-51 Mustang had begun its life as a disappointment, an aircraft ordered by the British in 1940 and powered by an American Allison engine that performed adequately at low altitudes but lost power above 15,000 feet. In the Mediterranean theater, these early Mustangs had proven useful for ground attack and reconnaissance, but they were considered unsuitable for the high-altitude escort role that was rapidly becoming the most critical mission in the air war over Europe. The breakthrough came through a combination of British engineering insight and American production capacity. Accounts vary as to exactly who deserves credit, recognized that the Mustang's excellent airframe could be transformed by replacing its engine with the supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that drove the legendary Spitfire. The marriage of American airframe and British engine created something unprecedented. The P-51B, which began arriving in Europe in late 1943, could fly at altitudes above 30,000 feet while maintaining performance that matched or exceeded German fighters. More importantly, it could do so while carrying enough fuel to escort bombers to targets deep inside the Reich. With external drop tanks, which could be jettisoned before combat, the Mustang had a range exceeding 1,300 miles. This meant that a pilot could take off from England, fly to Berlin, engage in aerial combat, and return home with fuel to spare. No fighter aircraft in the world could match this combination of range, altitude performance, and combat capability. The statistics tell part of the story, but they don't capture the psychological transformation. In December 1943, before the P-51s arrived in significant numbers, the 8th Air Force lost 5.1% of its bombers on each mission. By March 1944, as Mustang groups became operational, that rate had dropped to 3.5%. By June, it was under 2%. The Germans, who had been shooting down bombers faster than the Americans could replace them, suddenly found themselves in a battle of attrition they couldn't win. But more significant than the numbers was the change in German fighter tactics. Luftwaffe pilots, who had previously pressed their attacks with aggressive determination, now found themselves forced into a defensive posture, looking over their shoulders for the silver fighters that could appear at any moment, at any altitude, anywhere over the Reich. The impact on bombing accuracy was immediate and dramatic, though it manifested in ways that went beyond simple statistics. When bomber formations had been forced to fly without escort, they had faced a terrible choice. They could maintain tight formation and course to improve bombing accuracy, making themselves easier targets for fighters. Or they could take evasive action, breaking formation and making individual runs that reduced their vulnerability but scattered their bombs across the landscape. With Mustang escorts, that compromise was no longer necessary. Bomber formations could fly straight and level through their approach, allowing bombardiers the time and stability they needed to line up targets in their northern bomb sites. The difference between a bomb that lands 300 yards from a target and one that lands 50 yards from a target is often the difference between an ineffective raid and the destruction of critical infrastructure. The German war machine had been built on the assumption of certain geographical advantages. Factories and refineries deep inside Germany had been considered largely immune from strategic bombing, protected by distance and by fighter defenses that could be concentrated wherever attackers appeared. This sense of depth, of strategic sanctuary, had allowed German industry to operate with a confidence that would have been impossible if every factory had to be dispersed and hardened against air attack. The arrival of the P-51 eliminated that sanctuary. Suddenly, no target was too distant, no factory too deep inside the Reich to be vulnerable. The psychological impact on German workers was as significant as the physical damage. Men and women who reported to work at aircraft factories or synthetic fuel plants did so knowing that American bombers, escorted by fighters that seemed to have unlimited range, could appear overhead at any time. The oil campaign of 1944 demonstrates the transformation with particular clarity. German synthetic fuel production depended on a network of massive industrial complexes, plants at Luna, Perlitz, Gelsenkirchen, and a dozen other locations scattered across Germany and occupied territories. These facilities were enormous, covering hundreds of acres, employing tens of thousands of workers, representing investments of capital and engineering expertise that had taken years to build. They were also extraordinarily vulnerable to precision bombing. Unlike cities, which could absorb tremendous damage and continue functioning, or transportation networks, which could be quickly repaired, synthetic fuel plants required specific components to operate. A single critical cracking tower destroyed could shut down an entire facility for months. Before the P-51s arrived in strength, these plants had been considered too difficult to attack effectively. They were heavily defended, surrounded by flak batteries and within easy reach of German fighter bases. Bomber formations attempting to strike them had suffered heavy losses while achieving only modest damage. But beginning in May 1944, with Mustang escorts providing continuous protection, the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force flying from Italy began a sustained campaign against German oil production that would prove devastating. The statistics are stark. In March 1944, Germany produced 175,000 tons of aviation fuel. By September, production had dropped to 7,000 tons. This wasn't simply a reduction in supply. It was the effective elimination of the Luftwaffe's ability to train new pilots or conduct sustained operations. The German response to the fuel crisis created a cascade of failures that rippled through their entire military machine. Luftwaffe training hours were cut from an already inadequate 150 hours to under 100 hours, producing pilots who were technically capable of taking off and landing, but who lacked the experience to survive combat against American pilots who typically had over 400 hours of training before their first mission. German fighters were forced to rely increasingly on visual spotting rather than radar-directed intercepts to conserve fuel. Ground units found their mobility restricted, their tanks and trucks parked for lack of gasoline while Allied armies advanced. The strategic reserve that had allowed Germany to shift forces between fronts, responding to crises and mounting counteroffensives, effectively ceased to exist. But to understand what this meant to the men experiencing it, to the German pilots who climbed into their cockpits with fuel tanks that were no longer topped off, to the bomber crews who watched in relief as American fighters, maintained their escort all the way to the target and back. To the workers in the factories who saw the precision with which bombs now fell, requires moving beyond statistics into the realm of human experience. A Luftwaffe pilot's diary, recovered after the war and now held in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, provides a window into this transformation. The pilot, whose name was Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, flew Messerschmitt Bf-109s with JG-26, one of the elite fighter units that had dominated the Western Front since 1940. His entries from late 1943 are confident, even cocky. He describes successful interceptions, the satisfaction of seeing bombers fall from formation trailing smoke, the camaraderie of men who believed they were holding back an overwhelming force through skill and courage. But his tone changes in early 1944. "The American fighters are everywhere now," he writes in February. "We cannot reach the bombers without fighting through their escorts first, and when we do break through, they follow us down. There is no safe altitude anymore, no moment when we can relax our vigilance." By April, Hoffmann's entries have taken on a darker tone. "We lost Kruger today, shot down by a Mustang over Hanover. He was my roommate, my friend since training. The American pilot followed him down even after Kruger's aircraft was clearly disabled and on fire. I don't write this in criticism. I might have done the same. But it shows how completely the situation has changed. 6 months ago, we hunted them. Now we are simply trying to survive long enough to make one attack run before diving away. We are told that new jets will soon be available, that they will restore our advantage. But how many of us will be alive to fly them?" Hoffmann's last entry is dated May 17, 1944. It consists of a single sentence: "We are out of fuel again. 3 days grounded while the Americans bomb at will." He was killed 2 weeks later in combat over France. His aircraft was shot down by a P-51 flown by Captain Don Gentile of the 336th Fighter Squadron, who by that point had become one of the leading American aces, with over 20 victories. Gentile survived the war and later described the psychological advantage of flying the Mustang. "You knew you could go anywhere, fight anywhere, and have enough fuel to get home. That confidence made you aggressive. It made you hunt instead of just defend, and the Germans could feel it. You could see them looking for a way out of the fight, calculating whether they could disengage, whether they had enough fuel and ammunition to risk pressing an attack." This psychological dimension was as important as the technical specifications. German fighter pilots in 1944 were, on average, more experienced than their American counterparts. Many had been flying combat since the beginning of the war and had survived multiple campaigns. But experience without resources becomes a liability. The German pilots knew what they faced. They understood that every mission might be their last, not because they lacked skill, but because they were being asked to do the impossible, to defend a nation against an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources and technological superiority. The Americans, by contrast, flew with a confidence born of abundance. If an aircraft was damaged, there were thousands more being produced. If a pilot was lost, there were hundreds more completing training. This wasn't callousness. American squadrons mourned their losses as deeply as any military unit. But it was the confidence of a nation that had transformed its economy so completely for war production that material constraints had effectively ceased to exist. The bombing accuracy that German observers found so shocking was the product of this entire system. The Norden bomb sight, that complex mechanical computer that allowed bombardiers to calculate the precise moment to release their bombs, required stable flight conditions to function properly. Bomber formations needed to fly straight and level for several minutes during the bomb run, making only small course corrections as the bombardier aligned his crosshairs on the target. In 1943, this had been suicidal. German fighters would concentrate their attacks during these vulnerable moments, knowing the bombers couldn't take evasive action without ruining their bombing accuracy. Bombardiers were forced to rush their calculations, releasing bombs early or late, accepting degraded accuracy as the price of survival. With Mustang escorts, this calculation changed entirely. Fighter cover meant that bomber formations could maintain their course and altitude throughout the entire bomb run. Bombardiers could take their time, making fine adjustments, waiting for the perfect moment when wind conditions, aircraft speed, altitude, and target position all aligned. The result was bombing accuracy that improved by an order of magnitude. Pre-war bombing tests had suggested that half of all bombs dropped from altitude would fall within 1,000 feet of the aim point. In actual combat conditions in 1943, the 8th Air Force found that only about half of their bombs fell within 5,000 feet of the aim point. By late 1944, with reliable fighter escort and improved technique, the circular error probable had shrunk to under 1,000 feet for many targets, and elite Pathfinder units equipped with radar could achieve even greater precision in bad weather. The German reaction to this improvement in accuracy reveals how completely the strategic situation had changed. In 1943, German industrial planners had operated on the assumption that dispersal and redundancy could compensate for bombing damage. If a factory was hit, production could be shifted to alternate facilities. Workers could be housed in barracks near the plants, reducing their vulnerability to city bombing. Machines could be moved underground or into hardened shelters. But precision bombing made these adaptations inadequate. When the Americans could place bombs within 100 yards of a specific building, dispersal simply meant creating more targets that would each be struck with similar accuracy. When they could return again and again, escorted by fighters that made interception costly and dangerous, repair became a futile exercise. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, understood the implications with a clarity that bordered on despair. In his memoirs, written after the war, he describes the moment he realized Germany had lost the war in the air. It was not a single catastrophic raid, but rather the steady accumulation of damage to our fuel production that made victory impossible. We could replace aircraft. Our production actually increased throughout 1944. We could train pilots, though with decreasing quality. But we could not operate an air force without fuel, and we could not protect our fuel production from the American bombers and their fighter escorts. The long-range fighter changed everything. It eliminated our strategic depth, made every target vulnerable, allowed the Americans to bomb with an accuracy we had not believed possible. The symbolic power of the P-51 extended beyond its tactical effectiveness. For German soldiers and civilians who had been told for years that their technology was superior, that their fighting spirit would compensate for any material disadvantages, the Mustang represented a visible refutation of these claims. It was a beautiful aircraft, aesthetically pleasing in a way that suggested not just function but confidence. Its silver finish, unpainted aluminum that saved weight and announced its presence rather than trying to hide, seemed to German observers like an act of arrogance, a statement that the Americans didn't need camouflage because they controlled the skies so completely that concealment was unnecessary. This psychological warfare was deliberate, though perhaps not consciously planned. American military planners understood that modern war was as much about breaking an enemy's will to resist as destroying their physical capacity to fight. The steady, relentless pressure of daylight bombing, the visible presence of American fighters over German cities, the knowledge that no altitude or location provided safety. These combined to create a sense of inevitability that was perhaps more damaging than the bombs themselves. German civilians learned to recognize the sound of Merlin engines, the distinctive note that meant American fighters were overhead. Children could distinguish between the roar of a formation of B-17s and the higher pitch of P-51s weaving around them. These sounds became the audio backdrop of defeat, a constant reminder that the war was being lost in the skies above the fatherland. The actual combat between P-51s and German fighters produced aerial battles of extraordinary intensity. These weren't the romanticized dogfights of popular imagination, aircraft circling each other in gentlemanly combat. They were brutal, three-dimensional chess matches where altitude, speed, positioning, and split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. German pilots, flying aircraft that were often superior in specific performance categories. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 could outroll the Mustang. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 could climb faster, found themselves defeated not by technical inferiority, but by strategic impossibility. They were asked to defend an entire nation's airspace against an enemy who could appear anywhere, in overwhelming numbers, supported by an industrial base that produced fighters faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The numbers tell this story with stark clarity. In January 1944, the 8th Air Force had approximately 200 P-51s in operational units. By June, that number had grown to over 600. By December 1944, more than 1,300 Mustangs were operating from bases in England and Italy. German fighter production, despite Speer's efforts to increase output, was increasingly irrelevant because aircraft without fuel were simply expensive paperweights. Pilots without adequate training were casualties waiting to happen. The Luftwaffe's pilot loss rate in 1944 was unsustainable. Over 2,000 pilots killed in the first 6 months of the year alone, many of them experienced veterans whose replacements had a fraction of their flying hours. The transformation extended to the bomber crews themselves, whose entire experience of the war changed when reliable escort became available. Letters home from B-17 and B-24 crews in late 1943 had been marked by a fatalistic acceptance of the odds they faced. Completing a tour of 25 missions, later increased to 30, had been a matter of luck as much as skill. Crews calculated their chances of survival and found them wanting. But letters from mid-1944 forward show a dramatic shift in tone. The presence of little friends, as bomber crews called their escorts, transformed missions from suicide runs into dangerous but survivable operations. Crews could focus on their jobs, navigation, bombing, maintaining formation, rather than constantly scanning the skies for the German fighters they knew would come. This change had operational consequences that cascaded through the entire air campaign. Bomber crew morale improved, reducing fatigue and psychological casualties. Accuracy improved because bombardiers weren't rushing their calculations. Formation integrity improved because pilots could maintain position without worrying about individual evasive action. The entire system became more efficient, more deadly, more relentless. The 8th Air Force, which had struggled to put 300 bombers over a target in late 1943, was regularly launching raids of over 1,000 bombers by summer 1944, each protected by hundreds of fighters, striking multiple targets simultaneously with a precision that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The Germans tried to adapt. They introduced new fighter designs, the jet-powered Messerschmitt Me 262 and rocket-powered Messerschmitt Me 163, that possessed performance capabilities the Mustang couldn't match. But these technological solutions came too late, and in too small numbers to affect the strategic balance. The Me 262, which could have been a formidable weapon if introduced earlier, was hampered by Hitler's insistence that it be developed as a bomber rather than a fighter, by fuel shortages that limited its operational radius, and by the vulnerability of its jet engines to damage from debris on rough airfields. The Me 163, though capable of incredible speed and rate of climb, had an endurance measured in minutes and was as dangerous to its pilot as to enemy bombers. These weapons represented German technical ingenuity, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental strategic reality that Germany was being outproduced, outfought, and outthought by an enemy that had learned how to combine technological innovation with industrial mass production. The symbolic resonance of the P-51 Mustang in this transformation cannot be overstated. It represented everything about American military power that the Axis had underestimated. It was designed with input from Allied partners, manufactured with unprecedented efficiency, powered by an engine that represented the best of British engineering, and produced in quantities that reflected an economy that had completely retooled for war production. The Mustang was proof that democratic nations, written off by fascist theorists as decadent and unable to make hard decisions, could not only match but exceed the military capabilities of authoritarian states. For the German soldiers and civilians who witnessed the transformation of the air war, the shock wasn't simply about one aircraft or one tactical innovation. It was about the sudden realization that every assumption underlying their strategy had been wrong. They had believed that war could overcome material disadvantage, that fighting spirit could compensate for industrial weakness, that superior tactics could defeat superior numbers. The P-51, escorting bomber formations to targets that had previously been considered untouchable, demonstrated the hollowness of these beliefs. It showed that in modern industrial warfare, abundance mattered, that the ability to produce thousands of excellent aircraft was more important than producing hundreds of perfect ones. That strategic depth meant nothing when the enemy could reach anywhere with overwhelming force. The epilogue to this story is written in the rubble of German cities and the silence of grounded Luftwaffe squadrons. By the spring of 1945, German fighter opposition had virtually ceased. Not because German pilots had lost their courage or skill, but because they had lost the fuel, the aircraft, the training time, and ultimately the hope that resistance could change anything. The silver Mustangs that escorted the final bombing raids of the war flew through skies emptied of opposition, visible symbols of a victory that had been won as much by industrial capacity and technological innovation as by individual courage. The men who flew those Mustangs, American pilots from small towns and big cities, farm boys and college graduates, represented something that totalitarian theories couldn't account for. They were products of a society that valued individual initiative, that rewarded innovation, that believed in the capacity of free people to accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demanded it. The Mustang was their tool, but they were the weapon. And the lesson of their success, written in the skies above Germany in 1944 and 1945, was that freedom and abundance, when properly directed and organized, generate a power that no amount of ideology or fighting spirit can overcome. The shock that German pilots and civilians experienced when they encountered the full force of American air power wasn't simply military defeat. It was the shattering of a worldview, the recognition that everything they had been told about the weakness of democratic nations was propaganda rather than truth. The P-51 Mustang, that elegant synthesis of British and American engineering, became the symbol of this revelation, proof that the arsenal of democracy was not a slogan but a statement of fact, that American industrial might, once fully mobilized, was an unstoppable force that could reach into the heart of the Reich and extract a terrible price for the hubris of those who had started the war. In the end, the transformation wasn't just